Okay, so the last social factor we're going to look at is ethnicity, and so dialects based on ethnicity are often called ethnolects. So, to give some English examples, we have African American Vernacular English in North America, Chicano English spoken well across the states, especially in this southwestern U.S. and California. We can take the example of Singapore English or Singlish. And like any non-standard dialect, these are often stigmatized or considered less correct, but like all dialects are systematic and rule governed. I'm going to give a couple examples here. So just a couple phonetic phonological features of some of these three examples I gave. So, for instance, in African American English, there's an I-ow merger in some varieties. You see metathesis systematically. In Chicano English, there's different varieties of Chicano. So none of these is a homogeneous dialect in and of itself, but some of these are features of some of the varieties. So in Chicano English, sometimes the ing suffix will be pronounced as ing instead of ing. Also, you will occasionally hear a dental instead of an alveolar T and D, and this so the word nothing might be pronounced more like nothing. Singapore English is characterized by shortened aspiration on voiceless stops, consonant cluster reduction. So anyway, these are just examples of some phonetic and phonological ways that these dialects can vary. So in this context, I want to introduce a type of experiment that I don't think we've talked about before in this class. It's called a matched guise task. And what a matched guise task is in this context is that you have listeners who are the experimental participants, basically. Listeners are hearing the same person saying the same thing, but the person speaking with different accents, but they're saying the exact same content. And then the question is, well, how does the listener's perception differ based on just the accent? And so I'm going to, again, send you to a video here, which is, again, a pretty short video. So watch that and then come back after you've watched it. Okay, so let's listen to these examples.
Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper. Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper.
And the third.
Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper.
Okay, so anyway, I mean, you just watched the video, which gave an explanation, but as will probably surprise no one, even with the same content, people are less receptive to the non-standard accents. I wanted to talk just a quick description of a study of Singapore English that was done by actually one of my friends who was in graduate school with me at the University of Arizona. And so Priscilla was interested in, so I already mentioned some features of Singapore English. It's been studied before. But she was interested, sort of like Labov was interested in how people speak differently in different situations. Priscilla was interested in how Singaporeans change the way they speak when they're talking to different people. So what she did was she recorded interviews where she had participants talking first of all to a fellow Singaporean, so someone who is just one of their friends who's from there. Then she gave them an interview, and Priscilla has some associations with Singapore, but she's also from the States, and so she was sort of halfway an insider, halfway an outsider. And then she had them speak with an outsider who had absolutely no association with Singapore. And then what she did was she measured those features that I mentioned before, consonant cluster reduction and aspiration of stops, and found that the more insider the person was, the interviewer was, the more that people would be using these characteristics of Singapore English. So again, this shows that people really can manipulate the way that they talk in a really fine-grained way to reflect the communicative situation that they're currently in. the last thing I want to talk about is dialect discrimination. So we've already seen a little bit of this in the matched guys task, but I just wanted to show you this graph that's gives a very clear picture of dialect discrimination. So this was a study where they played potential employers different accents and then asked how likely they were to get hired. So I want you to take a look at this graph. And so on the y-axis here, it shows the likelihood of getting hired. And they asked the employers how willing they would be to hire each person for a customer-facing job. In other words, one where they would be interacting with customers, and then also a non-customer-facing job where they would not. And so I want you to think about what this graph tells us about, first of all, the overall hireability of the different accents, and also whether there are differences in hireability based on the type of job. So the first thing you can see is that there's clearly a higher likelihood of getting hired with an American or a British accent across the board than the Indian, Chinese, or Mexican accent. However, the other interesting thing is that there's a difference between the type of job for these three less hireable accents. In other words, there's even more discrimination when the job is going to be customer facing, presumably because the person who's hiring, they're already being discriminatory based on the accent, and they probably know that customers will too, right? And so this just shows that, it shows the overall potential discriminatory problems overall, but also that this could be even higher in certain situations. In this case, when they're going to be in a position, hiring for a position working with customers. And by the way, I just wanted to talk about, so sometimes people will say, well, this isn't dialect discrimination, it's because I can't understand other accents. And this is not really a very good argument because actually people are really good at adapting to accents. There's been lots of research showing this. And also intelligibility and accentedness are to some extent independent. So you can have a non-standard accent and be perfectly intelligible. So again, the differential is more likely to represent social discrimination rather than not being able to understand. Okay, so it's really easy to judge all these people we've seen in these experiments who have been discriminating against accents and judging people's vowel differences, but we all have language attitudes, and we all have ideas about what's correct and what's annoying. So there's a couple final features I want to talk about. So one is vocal fry, which I'm going to have you watch a video about, and the other is uptalk. And so you'll hear vocal fry in the video. Uptalk is when it's this style where you always end everything in a high-pitched tone, like I'm doing now, even when it's not a question. And it's sort of stereotypical of young women's speech. Maybe not so much anymore, but when I was in high school and college, it certainly was. And so when I ask students in class if this irritates them, a lot of people raise their hand. Now I want you to go and watch these two videos on vocal fry right now. They're fun, I promise. Okay, so as you can see, these people have very strong opinions about vocal fry. And by the way, the thing about like the health, that it will harm your vocal folds is total BS, not true at all. And it's weird, it's weird the interpretation she says. So she says, don't start speaking like frogs, don't be lazy. How is it lazy to be, like, it doesn't have anything to do with laziness. Note that none of these criticisms have any basis in reality, right? So, like dialects, opinions about these things are usually linked to the perceived social characteristics of those people using the relevant forms. And also, they generally reflect the tendency to be wary of change and innovation, which tends to be implemented by younger speakers. Okay, so that's about all for sociolinguistics in this class, although I highly encourage you to go take the actual sociolinguistics course, 256. It's a super interesting field. But overall takeaways from today, so language varies based on pretty much any social factor you can think of. Younger speakers, and some people say females in particular, although that's sort of debated, are linguistic innovators who are leading language change. Remember that language change is always happening at all times. It's not just something that happened in the past. Different dialects and accents are all characterized by systematicity, and no dialect or accent is more or less correct or good than another in terms of linguistic structure. So instead, language attitudes tend to reflect social attitudes. And so I'm not trying to be too preachy here, like, you don't have to like everything. But when you realize that you have a problem with the way someone's talking, and me too, like, we should take the time to think rationally about why we have a problem with it and decide whether the problem might actually be with our own attitude. Okay, that's all for today. See you next week.